Back to the phones. Phil is calling tonight. Welcome to the program. You're on live.
Hello.
Mayor, this is Phil Mocek calling on behalf of the Cannabis Defense Coalition. I spoke with you briefly Monday after your meeting about marijuana policy. And I have a question about police priorities.
Okay.
According to the police, the evidence that led to the search you talked about earlier in the show was a fan in the window and the smell of marijuana outside the window. The smell was good reason to suspect that there was marijuana inside. Surely, though, most of the time someone has marijuana in his home, it's intended for personal use. The police haven't reported having any reason to suspect that Will's apartment contained marijuana intended for anything other than personal use. So it seems that this case was one that requires the Seattle police to treat as their lowest enforcement priority. Do you agree?
Well, you know, I like that you have a pointed finish to the question. This is why I have asked the King County Sheriff, our police chief, King County prosecutor, City Attorney Pete Holmes, and Nick Licata to meet and talk about how do we deal with how do we, at a practical policy level, at an operational level, giving direction to our police department, how do we talk about and how do we make decisions about these types of issues? And you've raised legitimate and valid questions about, did the police look at enough issues? Did the police make a determination about whether this was something serious that required police intervention, or was this something that shouldn't have been addressed? And that's what we're looking at and working on. And as I mentioned earlier on the show, I don't know if you were watching earlier, the fact of the matter is there are serious grow operations and which are the sources of violence. And the source of that ultimately is that we treat marijuana, you know, part of the problem is how to distinguish between someone who's growing for medical marijuana use or personal use, which is fine, or somebody who is growing in a way that, you know, it can be a scene or target for violence. How do we make that distinction? You're saying the police should have known up front. What we're doing is we're going to take a look and start asking the hard questions about how should the police react in this situation, what are the appropriate procedures and protocols to follow so that we make the best choices possible.
And I apologize to Phil. I accidentally cut him off, and I think he was going to do a follow-up, so I apologize. Here's an emailer on another Seattle Police Department topic, but different than pot, of course. Quote, what's your reaction to the report that John Williams' carving knife, this, of course, is a gentleman that was killed recently by a Seattle police officer, which he was supposedly wielding at the police officer who fatally shot him, was actually folded closed when it was found next to his body? It seems a clear sign that the officer was absolutely in no danger, writes Pete.
Yeah. So I understand, you know, the significance of the evidence and what that means. And we've spoken about this before, CR. I'm kind of boxed in a little bit on this because we have a process that we follow in which we're going to make a determination. And I don't think it's appropriate for me to anticipate that determination. Our Firearms Review Board has done a review and will make recommendations to the chief about whether the actions of the officer were justified or not. Here's what's interesting about this process, though, is we're not supposed to talk about the conclusions of our report until a full public inquest is done. And that public inquest is something that's has begun. It's done at the King County level. There's a jury present. All of the evidence we found and determined, our police department found through its investigation will be shared at that inquest. It'll all be made public, and there'll be a determination made there. Once that determination is made at the inquest, we can then, at the city, announce our conclusions about whether the shooting or the use of force was justified or not. But I certainly do understand the implications of this evidence, and I understand why the public has a lot of concerns about whether the use of force here was appropriate.
Okay, again, we're here till the top of the hour, 684-8821, 684-TV21. Ask your question for the mayor. Back to Phil. I believe you're back on the line. You wanted to follow up about the pot policy.
Hi, yeah. My question wasn't so much about how should police talk about this, but whether the mayor thinks that the smell of marijuana outside someone's home indicates that it's probably something other than personal use. It seems to me that, for instance, you were talking about the man with the knife. When the police see someone with a knife, they shouldn't always assume that he's a cop killer and open fire. And when the police smell marijuana outside someone's home, they shouldn't assume that he's got a commercial garden in there and go in with guns blazing.
Okay, let's get a response then.
But the mayor thinks that this was anything other than the lowest law enforcement priority.
Okay.
Well, you know, if the question is if the only evidence you have is the smell of marijuana, is that a high enforcement priority? And the answer is it's not a high enforcement priority. In that hypothetical. In fact, we've had the same question with respect to what we're doing, outside of suspected grow operations. Clearly, the police felt that they had evidence to believe that there was a grow operation occurring. And again, it was driven by a neighborhood complaint, a neighbor complaint that that's what was occurring. And there's a fair question raised as to whether in these circumstances the police should have done more. The mere smell of marijuana, I can tell you, I don't believe our police force considers the mere smell of marijuana to be a belief that a grow operation is occurring. And in fact, I think a police department takes fairly seriously the lowest enforcement priority. I'll give you an example. At Folklife, as an example, people complain that somebody else at Folklife near them is smoking marijuana. And they will call over the security at Folklife. And those security will escort that individual off the grounds, and they'll usually be accompanied by a police officer. And the reason they're accompanied by a police officer is sometimes people aren't happy about being escorted off the grounds. The police don't arrest people in those circumstances. That's not a high enforcement priority. And there are loads of examples I can give you about the police not treating the mere smell of marijuana or use of marijuana as an enforcement priority. In this case, the police believed they were facing some type of grow operation, and I know you question whether there was sufficient evidence for that, and we are taking that type of request for a search warrant more seriously by putting it through a higher level of review. But I think the police do treat it as the lowest enforcement priority. I think there are places where it gets a little more gray or more ambiguous, and I think it's our job at a policy level, with the prosecutor and the city attorney and Councilmember Licata, to give guidance to the police department as to how they should treat it in the future.